The crowd beholds an interesting sight. Two knights look at each other in complete silence, their intents just as vicious as the events that are about to unfold. Dagger on their belts, armor on their bodies, and in their hands, a heavy, but not overweight polearm, a spike on the bottom and a complex head at the top. It is without a doubt the 15th century poleaxe. There are two main assumed ancestors that have contributed to the birth of this intimidating anti-armor weapon: the Dane axe and the warhammer. The Dane axe was a menacing polearm in the early Middle Ages and beginning of the High Middle Ages, used by, among others, the Vikings and elite Anglo-Saxon housecarls. Who you callin' Pinhead? Who you callin' Pinhead? The Dane axe allowed for the wielder to enjoy both the advantages of a regular axe along with tremendous reach. The blade could be used for hooking and slashing with plentiful force behind each swing. The warhammer appeared much later than the Dane axe and was essentially quite similar to the mace in the sense that it was a blunt anti-armor weapon. It usually had a spike, often shaped like the beak of a crow on one end, and a blunt part on the other. The beak could be used for all sorts of hooky and stabby fun, while the blunt end could turn even the worst cook's brains into ravioli. Mamma mia, would you like some pasta? The warhammer was used by both cavalry, knights and infantry as a means of combating heavy armor. The poleaxe started to appear in the late 14th century and was mostly used by heavily armored knights. It was an evolution of its own and naturally combined all the features that Dane axes and warhammers enjoyed. It had long reach, impact and force of a Dane axe, while it also had the blunt force, hooking capabilities and design of a warhammer. In fact, you could argue that a lot of poleaxes look like big, overgrown, silly warhammers. By the 15th century, the poleaxe was used mostly in duels between armored knights and men-at-arms. Unlike halberds and bills, which were usually much longer and designated more for battlefield use rather than one-on-one combat. And indeed, speaking of which, poleaxes are confused a lot with halberds. While they do look similar in a certain way, they are very different designs. Halberd heads were typically forged out of one piece and were a lot larger, whilst the poleaxe made use of a smaller head and was also usually riveted onto the shaft. Some people argue that a quality poleaxe was just as complex as a longsword in terms of construction and assembly. The poleaxe came in many shapes, sizes and forms, but the design usually stayed the same in essence, and it shared traits with plentiful other polearms of its time in its anatomy. A typical poleaxe had the following features or characteristics. On one side there was a bit specialized for percussive strikes and blunt impact. This part was useful for denting and even puncturing plate armor. On the opposite side there was a blade used for slashing and cutting, but it could also be used for percussive hits. Sometimes this part was shaped like the beak of a crow, a bec de corbeau. Usually a little below said blade there was a hook of sorts. This could be used for all sorts of fun, like unsaddling riders from their horses or making a poor bastard trip and fall on the floor. Trip. On the top there was a part utilized for stabbing and piercing flesh. In the historical fighting manuals, this spike or spearhead was used for thrusting in between the gaps of the plate armor, such as the armpits or the groin. The anatomy of the poleaxe was designed specifically for combating late medieval plate armor. Indeed, it was a force to be reckoned with in a duel, the tournament grounds, or sometimes on the battlefield. A lot of people consider the poleaxe a medieval can opener, and that couldn't be a more accurate term to describe it. What are you gonna do with that, good sir? Wait, oh god, oh no, oh no, oh! I am the poleaxe. Heavy, vicious, and deadly. I deliver blows more powerful than any other handheld weapon. This is what world-renowned fencing master Fiore de Liberi says about the poleaxe. Plentiful 15th and 14th century fighting manuals exist on using it in combat. The primary sources are from the Italian and German manuscripts. Many people believe the poleaxe was easy to use, but in reality it was a very sophisticated weapon that required plentiful skill to use most efficiently. The manuscripts show all sorts of hooking, striking and binding used in an armored duel with the poleaxe. There are very interesting techniques for the weapon. Some are cruel and primitive than others. This illustration from a book by Fiore de Riberi, for example, shows a person literally lifting his opponent's visor and jamming the poleaxe into his face.
Why yes indeed, Johnny. You might be able to immobilize a man by jamming a poleaxe into his frontal lobe.
Sir, please stop, I can see the bright light! Fiore even describes the ingredients and recipe for creating a corrosive, burning compound of sorts which is put on the poleaxe. He mentions that this material is so dangerous that if the opponent's eyes get touched only a little by it, they will likely get permanently blinded. He considers this vicious and cruel though, and says that he put it into his manuscript merely for the purpose of knowledge. All in all, the poleaxe is, at least in my humble opinion, a severely underrated medieval weapon that should get more attention in literature and screenplay. Now, as you should know, I am not an expert on the matter. It was, however, very fun making this small source of information. I hope you enjoyed it. Cheerio to you, and I'll sip my tea in honor of you, the fine viewer. Have a dandy day!